Hey everybody, it's Booksy here. I'm just doing a quick recap and um, a little bit more on what we're going to see maybe this next week, and then talk a lot about volume today. I just wanted to point out real quick kind of like where we are and where we've been. I know that some of you watched the previous video, and so you're already pretty much up to date on this theory, this cycle theory that I have about the stock, what's going on with the algorithms, which I find valuable because it helps me to understand the price action better, and then also not necessarily predict exactly where it's going to go, but have a better idea of the way this thing is trending, um, and a better language for understanding the trend. So just so everybody knows, if you didn't watch the other videos, if we look at this on the daily chart, and oh, you can see that I've marked off these cycles with these vertical bars, that we experienced 3 short 46 bar cycles and 3 longer 74 bar cycles, and then 3 medium 67 bar cycles. And so altogether, we've had 9 cycles in a row, and we're on what I would call the 10th cycle right here. And then we're actually changing. So we've had 3 in a row that were 46, 3 in a row that were 74, 3 in a row that were 67, and now we've got one that's 55, which is not like any of the other ones we've seen. But it didn't surprise me because I said in the very first video I made, this was kind of before we were like over here or something, that I thought that we could be entering into a new cycle depending on how you drew this wedge. And sure enough, I'm starting to believe more and more that this is the start of a new cycle. It's going to be confirmed this week, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But basically, the way this cycle works is that right before the cycle shift, you have basically a sell-off that causes this first U shape. Let's look at a really simple one to sort of track here as an example. You have this sell-off that causes this U shape. Actually it's the second part of the sell-off, okay? But this is how it starts, and then we always consolidate basically into a wedge. This wedge can be a rising wedge. We see the rising wedge most commonly in the bull runs. We see a descending wedge in the bear runs. But basically we have a U, we have a wedge, and we have another U. And the second U is really important because this is the beginning of the reset. Like, this is what restarts the cycle. And it's always very odd because it's actually breaking down. So in a rising wedge, you might expect to break down, right? But in a falling wedge, a lot of times it breaks up. And if you're looking at other stocks and you see a falling wedge and it's losing volume as it's falling, that usually means that, and we'll talk about that over here a little bit, is it usually means that we're about to have a reversal. But ATER doesn't care. ATER always breaks down, and I think it's because whoever is running this algorithm, the composite algorithm, is causing a sell-off. They're shorting, they're maximizing the profits from wherever they bought in, whether it's up here or in a bull run. They're creating like a bear trap, okay, to help push the stock higher. So it doesn't matter whether they're doing bull traps on the way down or bear traps on the way up. They're trying to maximize profit. So here they're causing a sell-off, and this was COVID. This one doesn't really count as much as the others maybe as an example, but they're just causing the sell-off. They're probably covering the short positions that they made up here. They're deciding direction with the second U, and then they're going to keep going from there. So that being said, I'm not 100% clear on how volume has affected this thing as it's gone along. I'm still digging into that, looking at a lot of data, but I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts today. So assuming you're on board with that, that's kind of where I'm at with it. And currently we're, again, at the change of a cycle. We broke out of a wedge, and we're seeing the second part of the W form, which would be the second part of this little run here. And you might be wondering, well, if this is the first run, it didn't look very strong. And you're right. Typically, the first run in this downtrend has been really strong, like this first drop. We had a 41% drop, a 62% drop. This has not been that dramatic. But I think it's probably more or less because we're in more of like this wedge right here, okay? And you might be thinking that this doesn't make any sense, but if you look at where the volume is here, it's pretty low, and these are not super dramatic sell-offs, okay, when the stock is kind of flat. So I'm seeing that this might be sort of a flat, like the basin of a bowl, okay, right here, and the base of a turnaround. I'll get more into that in a few minutes. First, I want to give a shout out to 3 people in the Discord who have some really good TA points that I want to bring up. First is Trader Girl. If you look at this on an inverse, this is what the bears will be looking at. So in this case, if you're a bear, you're looking at, or you're shorting this, you're looking to see that this red is going up, right? Because this is lower values up top now. So if you look at this thing inverted, this does not look like a bullish bearish scenario, right? Like if I'm a bear looking at this is scary. This looks like a fallout, right? Like we just broke beneath this support line and we're testing it and we're not breaking out. And this is a lower high, right, on the bear chart. So to me, looking at this does not look good if I'm a bear. This looks like it's about to do what it did over here. If you look at this area over here, we had this kind of run up. It tested, got a little higher, and then it just kind of kept going. And this was during the bull run. So we run up, we're testing, and we're getting we're not getting a clear direction up from here, right, back towards these lower numbers. So shout out to Trader Girl for pointing that out to me. It's a really good way of looking at a chart from the bear's point of view and to sort of weigh the bear case against your own. And then the other shout out I wanted to give, if you look at this on the weekly chart, one of our members in the Discord, Devil with a 6, it's like D6ville. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to mean. But if you look at this, there's a gravestone doji right here on this week, which is like kind of this flat bottom with a tall wick. And this would be a gravestone. This would also be maybe a gravestone, though this one's not as maybe obvious as this one. But basically, if you're in a trend and you see this gravestone, that's not usually a good thing. That typically means, or if you're in an uptrend and you see this, that typically means you might see reversal, because what it looks like is that bulls pushed it up really hard as they could, but then it got really sold off. It's losing momentum typically, whereas this one, is a very full candle with a little push down, but that's just a basic up and down, basic retracement stuff to kind of cool off indicators. So here we see this at the bottom here. This could indicate a reversal of the trend. Now, the only bearish scenario I can think is that this is actually a fake out. It wasn't actually the change of cycle. This is longer. And so this would then signal us that, more downside could be coming. Okay, that we might fall out here and keep going down. I don't see that very much in the volume. If you look at the trend of this volume, I'm not really seeing that case. And then when we get to these indicators, you'll also see why I don't really buy into that at this point. I really do think that at this point, I'm going to leave the doors open until they're shut. But at this point, I think that we're in the change of a cycle. I think we're in a new cycle now. And then one more shout out to another member of the Discord who is Dime Dozen. So they pointed out this chart, and this looks a lot like, this looks a lot like this chart because it's this time period. And what it's indicating here is the amount of trades, so like the transactions. So instead of counting volume based on the amount of shares that are traded, it's like every time a transaction happens, it's counted. And you'll see that the lowest amounts are right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at the end of this period, which does coincide with our volume. And I brought up a little volume chart. So here's the volume. Okay, so these look very similar. They're not super different. There are some differences in sort of the amounts as you look at them, but largely speaking, they're very similar. And the last two have been bullish days, but they're the lowest in terms of transaction. And then really, this day, this volume that happened after hours was all bullish. It ran up, and then the shorts kind of dumped in. But I want you to notice with this that there is this sort of diminishing quality in terms of the amount of transactions that are happening, and still the green to me is like really standing out. There's this kind of double bull here, and when bulls are stepping in, they're coming in force, okay, and they're meeting. You can see these two kind of match up. This is exceeding anything around it. This could be maybe compared to this area, but again, they're kind of exceeding in terms of the quantity, the amount of shares traded, or excuse me, the amount of transactions. They seem to be exceeding when they do step in the bears. But that being said, you can't look at this and say, oh, this is bullish right here, unless you look at the volume and just see how it diminishes. Okay. So that being said, I wanted to point out a couple things I noticed. So when you look at these trends and you look at like the beginning versus the end of each one of these kind of swoops, it's good to sort of go in and look at it either on a daily or a 4-hour for sure. But the more like minute you get, the more like the picture becomes sort of clear as to what's going on. So if we look at one of these, let's look at this. Let's look at this right here, this region right here. So I'm going to zoom in just a bit so we can see it better. Okay. And what happens is you're seeing like this sort of M shape, right? And the M shape to me shows that the buyers buy in force, but then there's just a lot of selling pressure, so it's going down. And we see this on a macro scale quite a bit, this like M shape, when we're in a downtrend. Now the larger U shape, you typically see that when you're bullish, because what it means is that when we're getting to these low values, like bulls are stepping in and running the price up in force. And this is where you get the narrative that, oh, it's a pump and dump, right? But really, like, you can't make that argument on the larger scale with this stock. It looks manipulated, sure, but I don't think it's retail that's causing this dump. It doesn't make any sense, right? Retail couldn't altogether time this. I do think that retail follows, these sell-offs and gets worried and sells maybe, but I think most of this is shorting. So that being said, by institutions, the algorithms. So that being said, there's kind of this trend you can see like on the upside. And let me get closer again so these bars will increase a bit. Where you see how there's a lot of tall green bars down here, but there's like so many red bars, right? Well, here on the upside of the bowl, you get those tall green bars again. 1, 2, 3, just get like 1, 2, 3 here. And they're almost evenly spaced, right? And then, but you do have not necessarily like higher volume, but you have more consistent green days, okay? And that would be your uptrend. So that's really basic stuff. Nobody's gonna like argue with me about that. Well, if you look here, I just want you to see, what do you see, when you do the same kind of comparison here, you see those higher red bars, and then you start seeing more frequent green bars here. You got 2, then we've got 5, then we've got 3, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So right here, if you look at this region and this region, they're pretty comparable, and we definitely have more buyers stepping in at these levels than we do sellers. That's all there is to it. In addition, we have these trend lines. And to me, that's kind of a confirmation, and I'm going to show you some other things that sort of confirm this trend line. But right here, all right, was also very low volume. And this is the 4-hour chart, but these bottom 2 wicks were pretty low. And if I go to the daily, let's go to the daily, because I like seeing daily volume. On this bottom wick here, it's kind of an ugly looking wick, but on this bottom wick here, you have 2.25 million. All right, now around it, you have a little more. You have 3.7, 5.7. Right before it, you've got 1.4. So 1.4, 3.7, 2.25. Right, that's pretty low. So even though this was like at the bottom here, right, it looked pretty bearish. Like the volume had started diminishing quite a bit. So I've heard a lot of people saying, well, there's no buying volume, and I agree. Like, it's not really stepped in yet. Um, this volume is huge, right? Because this popped too quick. It ran up too fast. But basically, this would signify the whole upside of this first curve right here. So you see how much volume there is? 5, 10, 15, 55 or whatever. It's a lot, right? It adds up really quick. Well, this is 31 million. So I mean, like, if you're looking at these two bars, 11 and 31, that puts us in the 40 something range. So 40 million, right, on this upward side. Whereas here you had a lot more, sure. You obviously had more momentum here because of a lot of other things going on in the market. But my point is that I think we see this red bar, we get kind of nervous. But the same kind of bar appears over here, okay, followed by a second red day. And we shot up past this wedge, went down below it, and we retraced through it, got support, and ran and had the second U. And that's a pretty common sort of M pattern that I've been noticing on a lot of these transitions, where you kind of go past the previous wedge. See how you go past it? We go down below it, again, find support, and then we kind of run. Now here, it happens really quick. It kind of happened here. It got rejected on the bottom, runs above it, and then it finds support. It never really takes off. It just kind of rides beside it and goes up a little, and then it sells off. But if you were to go back and look at them, you do see this really common like whipsaw that happens around the previous wedge. So what do I see here? I see a whipsaw around the previous wedge. I think it's pretty clear. And I think the volume is, even though it's very, very low, to me, this is more bullish than bearish at this point, because it looks to me like the bears have lost a lot of steam. And like we showed, when you flip it upside down, when you look at the weekly doji, other things, it really does look like we're kind of coming to the end of a trend. So that being said, I wanted to talk more about a couple different things really quick. I'm going to keep it under 30 minutes. So basically you got a few minutes. I want to talk about a fractal that I found, and then I want to talk the rest of the time about volume and chart analysis on the volume. So I'm going to switch over to the 1 hour, and I'm going to talk about this right here, the sell-off followed by this kind of consolidation and then a run, next run. So I found a fractal. I noticed that here we had a bit of sort of a gator snap pattern where we had this wedge with 2 U's. And for this one, I'm going to go to the 15-minute. And I saw this gator snap pattern happen in this region where we had this sort of it was actually back here. I deleted them. We had some small ones, right? And they're hard to see unless you're in like line view sometimes, because when you're looking at this, you might see that as consolidation. And I saw that. And that had me questioning, because it did break up and create 2 U's, but it did not break down. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of interesting. It's different than what we've seen typically. But I had seen that before, and I thought to myself, well, where have I seen it break upward instead of downward, like our gator snap pattern, which happened yesterday right here. It broke down and created like a tiny U and then a big U and then started running up. And that was like right in this area. I'm not going to zoom in and show you that, but that's the one I was talking about. You'd have to use line to see it on the 1 minute. But I thought, I've seen this before. Where have I seen it? And I remembered that this happened back in this region right here. And it happened right here where we had just kind of like a normal wedge structure, and then we had a breakout and a run. And then I thought, well, I know I've seen it somewhere else where it didn't end in a sell-off. Like this one, it ran up, it lost steam, and then it ended in a sell-off. And I thought, I've seen it somewhere else. I've been looking at this chart for like weeks and weeks and weeks. Where else did I see this? And I remembered that I saw it right here in a lot of places. So this looks a lot like what we saw happen, okay, where you had this kind of dip, some consolidation, tried to hold, and then it just fell through. And then it consolidated again down here, all right? And this time it did kind of, if you look at it this way, you can kind of see that gator dip where it dropped twice and ran up, but you could also draw it like this, where basically it had consolidation, it broke out, it did sort of retrace a little, but then it came back when it found its support again. And then if you look at this on a little bit of a larger scale, it's kind of hard to deny this is a wedge, you know, because it did follow, okay, this structure of a wedge, and it had a normal breakout and a run. So what I did is I took these fractals, and these are pretty standard stock fractals. I mean, it's not complicated, right? It's just consolidation around a value, and then usually there's like a midline. You can kind of see it right there. And then you break up when your indicators are cooled off and the bulls are ready to go again. But the fractal itself was interesting to me because of that whipsaw. Remember I was talking about earlier, there was like that whipsaw effect where it goes up, it comes below, goes up above the previous wedge, goes below the wedge, then back up and down and so on and so forth. So I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. It does look a lot like what's happening right now. So let me go ahead and just compare the fractals. And what I found is pretty, you know, pretty cool. So if you look at this very first sell-off, you see right here, there's this drop, there's some consolidation, and then we kind of retest. All right, now this right here, to me, looks just like this. When we drop, it's not so much, again, about having to be one-to-one with the fractal. That's not the way to look at it. All right, the way to look at it is, how is this thing moving? Where did it need to go? Well, it needed to go below, okay? It needed to go below this wedge, and it needed to retest three things. Well, it needed to retest three things, right? It needed to retest the bottom of the wedge, this area. It needed to retest this trend line. It needed to retest this new U. And that's what this was, remember, below. So this whole region right here of consolidation and kind of like retesting could be thought of this whole region right here. All right, it's happened the same way. So then my expectation was, well, maybe on, and I saw this, I posted it in the Discord in advance, I thought maybe on Friday or Monday, we would see this part right here. And what I think this would look like, it could look a number of ways, right? But what I think it would look like, my best guess, there we go. All right, so what I thought we might see, if this right here, if this spike right here is mimicking this spike, you see that? That's a very strong possibility. And I thought about that too, because this was the first consolidation was right here, and then we had a second consolidation that went downward and retested the bottom of the U. So that could be this right here, all right? And you may not be convinced of that, but to me, that looks pretty darn similar, where you have this consolidation, we push up, we go down, we test the bottom of the U, and then we have continuation upward, and that was this. Now, if that's the case, then this is a very weak continuation, but it doesn't mean that this is going to suddenly turn bearish. It just means that maybe we're going into a period of tighter consolidation before we have like any big moves. If institutions start stepping in after we get this breakout above, we could see this thing fly, because again, remember we were talking about all the shorts that dumped in. Certainly they could dump in here and we could fly. So I wanted to show you that fractal. I think it's really significant. It's interesting, and I think it's indicative of what's going on behind the scenes when we see this like price movement. Okay. All right. To volume. So on the volume chart, I'm only going to look at the 1 hour. So I've talked a little bit about the volume indicators already. I'm not going to talk about volume oscillation today because it's not really the one that I'm like looking at the most today. I'm going to talk about these two. This is CMF, which is chalk and money flow. It's a good one to determine whether institutions are sort of selling off direction-wise distribution. And typically when you get overextended beyond 0.15, you'll start seeing that distribution starts occurring. And once distribution starts occurring, that means selling is about to start. You're not usually going to see a strong reversal. And you see how on the chart, the reversal looked really strong, but on the chalk and indicator, it was only barely scratching above into positive numbers. So that shows me a lot of sell-offs coming. But then also it can show you when we start getting back the other way that we might start seeing some buying occur, and that there is the possibility again of reversal. Well, I've been looking at this and I charted right before on the very first U. I kind of looked at the region around the first U, which is this section, this section, this section. And I was trying to look at what is going on with the money flow in those sections, and then what's going on during the wedge. So in the downtrend, and really in all of them, you can see that the wedge most of the time, not all the time, but the wedge most of the time is going down next. Okay, so what I did is I charted these, and then I charted sort of the last point of support as best I could tell from this downward channel, and compared it to what was going on sort of next. So here you see how this hits and then it comes up and then it hits again, but it hits higher, and it hit higher right on the bottom here. And that tells me again, buyers are stepping in sooner. Institutional buyers are stepping in sooner, and they're running the price up. So this right here, when it came back through, this would have been your indicator that this thing is trending up, is going up. What I noticed is that this is a pretty good indicator, and the U can be an indicator, the first U can be an indicator too, of sort of how much momentum you have going into the second U. And what's interesting is that this line right here, it doesn't match perfectly, but it definitely is a pretty good uptrend. You compare it to this one, which is a little more flat. Let me redraw that, make it a little bit more accurate, right? It's a little more flat. You see that? There's not much of a, it's still up, but it's not like a lot. This one actually kind of goes down and then it comes up a little. So this is mirroring that more. This one's pretty strong. Now, obviously, if you were looking at this at the time, you may not see the writing on the wall perfectly because you might have seen this, right, before this starts happening. And I'm obviously doing it in retrospect. But here, you can see that that's a pretty strong uptrend. Now, there are some times, like right here, it's pretty flat, and this is right before we ended up turning the opposite way, and sure enough, this second U stayed pretty flat. And then there are times where it kind of comes off the major trend early and sort of consolidates, and this could have been an indication that we're losing a little steam. But basically, I looked at these and they're all pretty consistent. Like they kind of show you where the second U might go, up or down. Not all the time, they're not perfect. I think there's 2 times where it didn't quite line up. Like right here, it says down pretty hard, but it really was more flat. And then it did drop like crazy. But what I noticed is just this one thing right here. Again, this is just pattern analysis. We have a widening channel here, and this goes significantly lower right here. So it's getting oversold sooner than it did over here. And it's going harder down, right? Because like, look at the value. So here we're higher up. Here we're lower down. You would expect if you're selling off here, right, to match with selling off here. So you would expect that this price right here and this price right here, this would be somehow lower, right? But that's not the case. It's a harder sell-off, but we're way higher. And then we're moving up. And I noticed that this was a widening channel, and there's not very many of those. There's some narrowing channels, but the only other widening channel I could find, like you could make a case for this one if you draw it this way. If you draw it this way, it's not as strong of a case. This is kind of a widening channel right before it goes sort of flat. And then this right here, the COVID channel, is a downward widening channel that has a reversal. And interestingly enough, this is the last time right? It touched this supposed line that we drew, and it was right here. So then I thought, well, it's touching the line again, but this time it's a different line. It's not this one, it's higher up. And I looked at this region on the VFI. The VFI is a lot like the on balance volume. It's just that the positive and negative values actually reflect bullish and bearish sentiment, respectively. And so obviously this thing has been bearish for a long time, and this kind of peaked into bullish, and now we're kind of skirting along the bottom. So I was looking at this region, and I tried to find another section of the chart where this occurred, this kind of tight bouncing consolidation. This was kind of close, but it doesn't line up in the cycle. And I'm talking about like right on the U's, this happens. So I was looking at these regions right on the U's, and there are some flat regions that indicate there might be a little bit of a reversal. But I was really looking for right on this 0 line. And the only other place that I found this occurring in this stock where you had this sort of back and forth occurring on the 0 line right beneath it, maybe this whole region right in here. But specifically, if we're just kind of narrowing in, this right here looks a lot like what we're seeing. And this was very volatile. And what we're seeing right now is not at all volatile, but this is very volatile, but it was the signal of this drop and then reverse. So it dropped below it, went up, kind of peaked above it for a second. You could look at it this way too, if you want to look at that. It has the peak above, below, and then it sort of sat below it before it tried to trend upward. And what we see here is we see on a larger scale, we see a peak above, and then it comes back below, and it's just sitting right underneath there. So again, I think that this, to me, you can see that there's kind of this volatility that occurs in this thing, and it's sort of widening, but then here it sort of tightens again. And I really think that if you combine this CMF indicator, what we're seeing here, and what we're seeing here with the chart, or with the rest of the indicator on here, this is kind of the only place where it sort of lines up and sort of looks similar. Like you can make cases for these regions, but they don't really line up with where we are in the cycle. So am I bullish? Yes, without a doubt. But do I think this thing is going to rocket? I don't know. I think there's a strong case to be made that we might be in store for a little squeeze, and that this was an attempt to sort of get a better price and see what's going to happen. I think a lot of it depends on get a better price to cover. I think a lot of it depends on what the buyers do, whether we see some whales or institutions step in, or if retail starts stepping back in. I think retail is a little nervous about this one because of this shakeout here. But hopefully this video gives you some confidence in knowing that even if this thing were to like coast sideways, I would still be very bullish. Even if we only get up to, let's say, $8, okay, I would still be bullish. And you might think that like with current volume, there's no way it's going to run past that. But remember, volume down here was like 2 million a day. I mean, it was really low, 3 to 2 million a day. And that's what we're at right now, 3 to 2 million a day. So don't worry. And I know this is, again, the second one. So you might be thinking, well, it's the second one. It's not the same. But you're right. It's not. This one already had the momentum. This one doesn't. But look where it ran up from this one, okay, to the second. All right, from this one to the second. It doesn't have to, but typically we don't see it only come back to, unless we're going to be sort of flat, we don't see it come back to the tip of the first cup. Like it doesn't just stop right here, it goes past it. So if it did stop right here, I would still be bullish. And honestly, depending on whether or not this held, I think it could look like this, right? Where we see this sort of wedge structure up, and then it breaks and everybody gets scared, and then it runs up again. If we see it run harder, maybe we'll see this go flat for a bit, right? And then come down and test that line again before it goes up. Do our little gator snap pattern. I posted about that on the Discord. I christened it the gator snap because it looks to me like a tail, a belly, and then a snout. tail, a belly, a snout, and they're kind of snapping to one another. So that being said, I don't have any. I know that $21 is kind of a hot spot for a lot of these indicators right now, and just in terms of breakout targets, it did come up a lot, but I don't think it has to hit it, and I don't think it has to hit it in this cycle. I think it could be the next cycle. But I do think that right now I'm pretty bullish on it, even if it's going more sideways. I'm still like bullish on it. I don't see it going down here easily since we've already tested this a few times and it seems to get gobbled up right on that line. And then also, even if it did come down here, I think we would see this kind of a movement. And this was a huge, like 500% move off of that line. And that would just confirm to me like a double bottom on that line, right? And that would still be very bullish in my opinion. So I don't think after that we would just sort of stay down there. Like that's just not how it would work. You can see that here, right? Like, and you can see that the last time we touched, 2 times we touched this line, it's just boom, like way back up to the center line every time. Okay, so I don't see it coming down here and just sitting. So any bear that's saying that just isn't paying attention, doesn't know how to read a chart, because the only 2 times it's touched this bottom line, it's come right back up to the center line. Now it did retrace, but again, I think it's just to give shorts time to get out again, and I think we're going to see a run up. I don't know if it'll be super extreme, but I think it's overconfidence on the bear's part, and I do think we're going to see it keep going. So anyways, hope you enjoyed it. Sorry it was a little long. Y'all have a good weekend.